In 1942, one historian calculated the most valuable bombing targets in America, the places where a single raid would do the most damage to the war effort. Seventh on that list, ahead of cities 50 times its size, sat a Vermont mill town of about 8,000 people. Its factories didn't build tanks, planes, or rifles. They built the machines that built all of them. That was 1942, when Springfield, Vermont was one of the most important industrial towns on Earth. By February 2002, a single bankruptcy filing shut off the lights for good. You're watching Trade Archive, where we dig up the industrial empires the world forgot. If a century of secret machines, war contracts, and one very strange underground mansion sounds like your kind of story, hit like and subscribe before we head back to Vermont. Windsor, Vermont, 1838. A 21-year-old named Richard Lawrence walked into town looking for work. He had grown up poor in upstate New York, taught himself gunsmithing, and had almost nothing to his name except a reputation for being able to fix anything with a barrel and a trigger. He found a job in the last place you would expect, a gun shop attached to the Windsor State Prison, where a local gunsmith named Nicanor Kendall was building rifles with convict labor. Kendall was a blacksmith's son who had patented his own underhammer percussion lock, and he paid Lawrence $200 a year for his hands. $200 a year to a man who would eventually reteach the British Empire how to make a rifle. For 6 years, the prison shop stayed small. Then, in the winter of 1844, a businessman named Samuel Robbins arrived in Windsor with news from Washington. War with Mexico was coming, and the federal government wanted rifles, 10,000 of them. Kendall and Lawrence had the skill. Robbins had the money and the connections. On February 18, 1845, the three men signed a contract with the United States government for 10,000 Model 1841 rifles at roughly $11 apiece, and Robbins and Lawrence went from a prison workshop to holders of one of the largest small arms contracts in the country. There was just one problem. A contract that size could not be filled the way guns had always been made, by a craftsman filing each lock and barrel to fit one particular weapon. If a part broke on a hand-fitted rifle, a gunsmith had to custom make its replacement. The United States armories at Springfield, Massachusetts and Harper's Ferry had spent decades chasing a different idea. Guns assembled from parts so precisely machined that any part would fit any gun. The National Armory at Springfield had been grinding at the problem since George Washington's administration, and by 1819, one of its mechanics, Thomas Blanchard, had built a lathe that could automatically copy an irregular shape, turning out identical rifle stocks by the thousand from a single master pattern. Historians would later call the whole approach the American system of manufactures, built on 3 legs, interchangeable parts, specialized machinery, and division of labor. In 1845, it was still half dream, half government experiment, proven inside federal armories, and almost nowhere else. No private company had ever staked its survival on it at this scale. Robbins and Lawrence decided to bet the entire contract on it. In 1846, they raised a 4-story brick armory on the banks of Mill Brook in Windsor, a building that is still standing today, and they filled it with something almost nobody in the world had ever seen, a production line of purpose-built machine tools. They hired a young mechanic named Frederick Howe, barely 25, who designed profiling machines, barrel drilling and rifling machines, and some of the first commercially practical milling machines in existence. Another of their men, Henry Stone, developed a turret lathe that could hold multiple cutting tools on a rotating head, so one operator could perform a whole sequence of operations without ever resetting the workpiece. These weren't just tools. They were the ancestors of nearly every machine shop on the planet. The bet paid off in a way that stunned the Ordnance Department. Robbins and Lawrence delivered all 10,000 rifles 18 months ahead of schedule, at a profit, with parts that actually interchanged. The machine tool historian Joseph Wickham Rowe later wrote that, of all the early American shops, None had a greater influence on the development of modern machine tools than this one brick building in Windsor. And the story could have quietly ended there, a good contract, well executed, in a small Vermont town. It didn't, because in 1851, the British Empire threw a party. The Great Exhibition of 1851 filled London's Crystal Palace with the industrial pride of every nation on Earth. Nearly 1 million square feet of glass and iron packed with steam engines, textiles, and jewels. The American section was, at first, a bit of a joke to the British press, half empty and heavy on farm tools. Then the mood changed. The McCormick Reaper out-harvested anything in Europe. Colt's revolvers drew crowds, and visitors started gathering around a display of 6 plain-looking rifles from Windsor, Vermont. The parts interchanged. A demonstrator could strip several rifles, throw the pieces together in a pile, and reassemble working guns from the mix. To American machinists, this was the payoff of 30 years of work. To British observers, it was close to witchcraft, because at that moment, the finest gunmakers in Birmingham and London were still filing every lock by hand, each gun a one-of-a-kind piece of craft. Robbins and Lawrence took home a medal, and the British government took home a very uncomfortable question. How had a village in Vermont beaten the workshop of the world? London's answer changed industrial history. Britain sent official delegations across the Atlantic to study American manufacturing, touring the Springfield Armory, Colt in Hartford, and the armory on Mill Brook. What the visitors reported back was almost embarrassed admiration. The observation that Americans reached for labor-saving machinery in nearly every industry, and that their gun factories in particular had left British methods behind. So in 1854, preparing for war in Crimea, the British government did something no great power had ever done. It ordered American machines to build British weapons, a contract for 25,000 Enfield rifles and, depending on which record you trust, somewhere between 141 and 150 Robbins and Lawrence machine tools, destined for the new Royal Small Arms factory at Enfield. A company that had started in a prison workshop had just become the first large-scale exporter of machine tools in history. Inside the Windsor Armory, it must have felt like the beginning of an empire. Lawrence and his partners assumed the Crimean War would bring follow-on orders for as many as 300,000 rifles, so they borrowed heavily, expanded the Windsor Works, and built an entire second factory in Hartford, Connecticut. The decision seemed obvious at the time. It wasn't. Rifle production ran badly behind schedule, hundreds per month when the contract demanded thousands, and then the war itself betrayed them. Peace came in 1856. Years earlier than anyone in Windsor had gambled on, and Britain canceled everything beyond the original order. Robbins and Lawrence had delivered only about half the rifles. Buried in debt with no customer, the most technologically advanced small arms maker in the world collapsed into bankruptcy. And this is where the story does something strange. The company died. The idea refused to. Richard Lawrence moved to Hartford and ran production for Sharps, whose rifles would arm the Union cavalry. The Windsor machinery and works passed through creditors into new hands, building Model 1861 muskets all through the Civil War, machinery in that lineage helping equip a Union war effort that outproduced the Confederacy in firearms by a staggering margin. And the machine tool bloodline of the old armory flowed on through a chain of successor firms until it pooled inside a struggling company with a soon-to-be famous name, Jones and Lamson. By the 1880s, Windsor's moment had passed, and Jones and Lamson was up for sale. 20 miles downriver, the town of Springfield, Vermont, was desperate. A flood in 1869 and a fire in 1880 had gutted its mills, and a local manager named Adna Brown decided the town would buy itself a future. Using a Vermont law that exempted new industry from taxes for up to 10 years, Brown rounded up Springfield investors, purchased Jones and Lamson, and in 1888 moved the whole operation to Springfield. It was a lifeline thrown by a dying mill town to a dying machine company. Neither of them had any idea what they'd actually caught. What they'd caught arrived the following spring. In April 1889, Jones and Lamson hired a 27-year-old superintendent from Connecticut named James Hartness. Hartness had left school for a machine shop at 16, made foreman of a bolt works by 21, and spent his nights designing a radical new lathe that every established builder had turned down flat. One skeptic dismissed the low, rotating design as a lazy Susan. Only one man in the industry, Ambrose Swayze of Cleveland, had seen the sketches and told people they would hear from that young man again. On one of his first days in Springfield, Hartness announced his plan for the struggling company, and it sounded like corporate suicide. Jones and Lamson built steam engines, gun machinery, whatever paid. Hartness ordered nearly all of it stopped. The company would make exactly one product, his rejected lathe, and it would make that product better than anyone on earth. The Springfield investors, who had just spent their savings buying the company, had every reason to fire him on the spot. They let him run. The machine was the flat turret lathe, patented in 1891, and it turned out to be one of the most consequential machine tools ever designed. By mounting the tool turret on a low, rigid flatbed, Hartness got stiffness and precision that vertical designs couldn't match, which meant faster cuts, heavier cuts, and parts that came off the machine identical, hour after hour. Hartness had negotiated a royalty of $100 on every machine sold, and as sales climbed toward 10 machines a day, the superintendent was at times earning $1,000 daily in the 1890s, while ordinary machinists made $2. Nobody in Springfield complained, because the machine was pulling the whole town up with it. A new industry called automobile manufacturing was waking up in Detroit, and it was hungry for exactly what Springfield sold: machines that could mass-produce identical precision parts. But Hartness's most unusual invention wasn't a machine at all. It was a philosophy. One company, one product. When his own engineers invented something outside that single product line, Hartness didn't bury the idea or hoard it. He pushed the inventor out the door, helped him raise money, sometimes invested his own, and set him up as a brand new company down the street. It might be the strangest growth strategy in American industrial history, a founder deliberately manufacturing his own competitors' neighbors, and it built an entire valley. The first spin-off started with a window dresser. Edwin Fellows was a former department store clerk from Torrington, Connecticut, with 1 year of high school, who joined Jones and Lamson in 1889 and turned out to be a mechanical savant. Working on gearing problems, Fellows had an insight that sounds simple and wasn't. Gears of the era were cut tooth by tooth with formed cutters, and any error in indexing left gears that whined, wore, and shattered. Fellows realized the perfect tool for cutting a gear was another gear, a hardened cutter shaped like a gear itself, rolling in mesh with the blank and generating mathematically true teeth automatically. With backing from Hartness and investor William Woolson, the Fellows Gear Shaper Company opened on July 13, 1896. By 1911, over a third of its production was shipping to Europe. By 1924, it had 700 men producing 100 gear shapers and 4,000 cutters every month, and virtually every automobile transmission on Earth depended on gears cut by Fellows machines or their imitators. Then it happened again. William Bryant joined Jones and Lamson in 1897, rose to chief engineer, and while working on chucking lathes invented a multi-spindle internal grinder, a machine that could grind the inside of a hardened steel bore to fractions of a thousandth of an inch. In 1909, on Hartness's advice and with Hartness's money, he founded the Bryant Chucking Grinder Company, with Hartness himself as first president. Within a year, Bryant grinders were being installed in the Ford and Cadillac plants, finishing the bearing races and cylinder parts that let engines run fast without tearing themselves apart. In 1916, the pattern repeated a third time with toolmaker Fred Lovejoy, whose Lovejoy Tool Company is still machining in Springfield today. The same year, over in Windsor, a machinist named Frank Cone founded the Cone Automatic Machine Company, to build multi-spindle automatic lathes. The trade press eventually gave the whole cluster a name. This stretch of the Connecticut River Valley, this string of small towns cutting the hardest, most exact metal parts in America, became Precision Valley. I mean, think about that for a second. A town smaller than a modern high school's district was supplying the core machinery for Ford, Cadillac, and half of industrial Europe, and almost every company doing it traced back to one man's office. It helps to understand what makes machine tools different from everything else in an economy. A car plant makes cars. A machine tool plant makes the lathes, grinders, and gear cutters that every car plant, engine plant, and weapons plant on Earth is built from. Machines that make machines. Whoever controls them sits upstream of all manufacturing everywhere, which is why a valley you could drive through in 20 minutes mattered so far beyond its size, and why, when the shooting started, it mattered more than almost anywhere else in America. And that man kept getting stranger, in the best possible way. In 1904, Hartness built a stone mansion in Springfield, then dug a 240-foot tunnel under the front lawn connecting the house to a 5-room underground apartment, a workshop, library, and study where he could think in total silence, with a turret telescope of his own design rising from the grass above it. Guests at dinner would watch the governor of the household simply vanish into the floor. Charles Lindbergh himself stayed at the mansion in 1927, months after crossing the Atlantic, one aviation pioneer visiting another, because Hartness had earned one of the first 100 pilot's licenses in America back in 1914, at age 53, and had carved Vermont's first real airfield out of Springfield farmland. During the First World War, he served on the national committees that standardized aircraft parts and screw threads, while Springfield's factories ran extra shifts, making machines for shells and aircraft parts, the valley's first taste of what a world war does to a machine tool town. In 1919, his protege Russell Porter arrived, an Arctic explorer turned optical engineer, and together they invented the Hartness optical comparator, a device that projected a screw thread's shadow at 200 times magnification, so an inspector could see a flaw invisible to any gauge. The next year, Porter founded a telescope makers club on a Springfield hilltop called Stellafane that amateur astronomers still make pilgrimages to every summer. And in 1920, the machinists of Springfield did something machinists rarely do. They elected their boss, governor of Vermont. Hartness held around 120 patents when he died in 1934, still president of the company he had bet on a single machine, and he left behind a valley full of companies that all, in one way or another, had his fingerprints on the founding papers. There's a reason this story is still talked about today, and part of it is the sheer density of unlikely people. Because Hartness's own son-in-law was about to outdo him. Ralph Flanders was a Vermont farm boy, born in 1880 into real poverty, who apprenticed as a machinist at Brown & Sharp, taught himself engineering at night, and became an editor at Machinery magazine in New York. In 1910, he came to Springfield to work for Fellows. Within a year, he'd married Helen Hartness, the boss's daughter, and Hartness put him in charge of Jones and Lamson's automatic lathe department, where Flanders redesigned the Fay automatic lathe into a machine that could turn finished parts with almost no human touch. In 1933, when the aging Hartness stepped aside a year before his death, Flanders became president of Jones and Lamson. And in a valley of conservative Yankee industrialists, he did something almost unthinkable. He welcomed the union in, making Jones and Lamson the first Springfield company to sign with the United Electrical Workers rather than fight them. For a while in the 1930s, things were actually quiet. The Depression had gutted machine tool orders, because when factories stop expanding, the first thing nobody buys is a new lathe, and Springfield's shops limped along at a fraction of capacity for the better part of a decade. That didn't last. Because when the world went back to war, it discovered that wars are not won by whoever has the most factories. They're won by whoever can build factories fastest, and the bottleneck for every factory on Earth was machine tools. The orders hit Springfield like a flood tide, first from abroad, then, after Washington embargoed exports from the United States government itself. By late 1940, Jones and Lamson was running 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, pausing only long enough to change shifts and sweep the chips. From 1939 to 1942, its production rose 600%. The three big Springfield firms and their foundry employed 5,400 workers in 1941 and roughly 7,450 by the end of 1942, in a town whose entire population was about 8,000. Read those two numbers together. There were nearly as many machine tool jobs in Springfield as there were men, women, and children in Springfield. Workers poured in from across New England and slept in shifts in rented rooms, the same bed warm around the clock. The federal government threw up an emergency housing project on the south side of town because there was physically nowhere left to put people. At Fellows alone, 3,300 people crowded the gear works, including 400 women running precision machines their fathers had been told women could never operate, holding tolerances of a 10,000th of an inch on parts headed for aircraft engines. Headline writers needed a name for this stretch of river that was outproducing entire states, and the one that stuck was the one the trade had been using for years: Precision Valley. What did all that effort actually produce? Not weapons, something more important. Fellows, shapers cut the gears inside aircraft engines, tank transmissions, propeller drives, bomb fuses, and aerial cameras. Bryant grinders finished the bearings that let those engines survive. Jones and Lamson lathes turned out the parts for everything else, and by one wartime accounting, this single Vermont town produced 20% of the machine tools in the United States. Which brings us back to that bombing list from the top of the video. The claim, repeated for 80 years in Vermont, is that Springfield and neighboring Windsor ranked 7th among American bombing targets if Germany or Japan could ever reach them. No captured enemy target list has ever confirmed it, and the story rests on one historian's wartime calculation. But the logic behind it is solid steel. Destroy a tank plant, and you lose tanks. Destroy Precision Valley, and you lose the ability to build the plants. By March 1954, the valley's influence had reached somewhere no machine shop had ever reached: the floor of the United States Senate. Ralph Flanders, the machinist's apprentice who had run Jones and Lamson through the war, had gone from the shop floor to the War Production Board to the presidency of the Boston Federal Reserve, and in 1946, Vermont elected him to the Senate. 8 years later, Senator Joseph McCarthy's red-baiting crusade had cowed nearly every politician in Washington into silence. Careers ended for less than a raised eyebrow in McCarthy's direction. And it was Flanders, 73 years old, a Republican confronting a fellow Republican, who stood up on March 9, 1954, and mocked McCarthy to his face on the Senate floor, then came back that summer and introduced the formal resolution to censure him. Party leaders begged him to drop it. He did not. On December 2, 1954, the Senate condemned McCarthy by a vote of 67 to 22, and his power evaporated almost overnight. The man who broke McCarthy had learned his trade filing steel in a machine shop. Springfield, it seemed, could manufacture anything, including courage. And the town at mid-century looked unbreakable. A 1959 study of Springfield found it producing 1/6 of the manufactured value in all of Vermont and more than 5% of the machine tools in the entire United States, from a town most Americans could not find on a map, and it carried the highest per capita income in the state. Machinists' kids went to good schools. The shops ran apprenticeship programs so deep and so respected that a Springfield-trained toolmaker could walk into any plant in America and be hired on the name alone. A job at J&L, Fellows, or Bryant was understood to be a job for life, and often a job for your son's life after that. American machine tools dominated the world market, and Precision Valley sat near the top of the American industry. It is genuinely hard to find a small town anywhere that ever punched further above its weight. But the foundations were quieter than they looked. The same handful of local families had guided these companies for generations, and the heirs did not want the shops. One by one, the companies of Precision Valley were about to become the property of men who had never set foot in the valley and who would never need to. It started quietly in 1958, when Bryant was sold to Excello of Detroit. In 1964, Textron of Providence, a conglomerate that owned everything from helicopters to pens, bought Jones and Lamson. In 1974, Emhart Corporation took Fellows. Within a generation, every founding firm of Precision Valley answered to a distant holding company, and the numbers tell you what that meant for New England. One Dun & Bradstreet analysis blamed absentee conglomerate owners for more than half of all the region's manufacturing jobs lost to plant closings between 1968 and 1976. The Valley's new owners harvested profits, trimmed investment, and treated 100-year-old companies as line items. Meanwhile, the shop floors were fighting their own war. Bryant's workers walked out for 21 weeks through a brutal Vermont winter in the late 60s, just to win a first union contract, and the long, bitter strikes that rolled through the 70s drove labor costs up exactly when the companies could least afford the fight. Because on the other side of the world, someone had been paying very close attention. Veterans of the Springfield plants remember the delegations of Japanese engineers who toured the shops in the 60s and 70s, cameras clicking, notebooks out, everyone smiling, and management proudly showing off every process on the floor. A few years later, those same veterans walked the aisles of the big Chicago machine tool show and stopped cold in front of machines that looked almost identical to their own, selling for half the price. And the copies kept improving until they were better than the originals. Because the Japanese builders had committed early and completely to a technology Americans had actually invented, computer numerical control, machines guided by code instead of a machinist's hands. There is a brutal irony buried in that, since automatic machining was the very idea Flanders had pushed forward with the Fay lathe half a century before. The Valley had spent decades teaching machines to work without people, and now foreign machines were doing it without the Valley. While the conglomerates kept squeezing the same manual designs their customers no longer wanted, Japanese and German CNC machines took the market apart. American machine tool sales collapsed from $5 billion in 1981 to $2 billion in 1983 and never recovered. Imports, 10% of the American market in 1973, climbed toward 60%. Locals who lived through it describe it with one phrase, a paradigm shift, and Springfield was on the wrong side of it. Endings came one after another. Textron split Jones and Lamson apart, shipped its famous comparator division out of state, and cut the Springfield workforce from 1,200 to 200 by 1981. In 1983, with the division bleeding $16 million a year, Textron announced it was moving manufacturing to Connecticut and Belgium. A group of local investors, led by a descendant of the founding families, tried to buy the company back and save it. They couldn't hold the tide, and in 1986, the great J&L plant on Clinton Street, the mother of the Big Three, went dark. Ownership of what remained shuffled through smaller and smaller hands until Bryant, Fellows, and the J&L remnants all landed inside a Massachusetts holding company called the Goldman Industrial Group. On February 13, 2002, Goldman filed for bankruptcy, and 790,000 square feet of Springfield factory space, 14 football fields of machine shops, shut down essentially at once. Bryant alone was rescued by new owners and survives today. Fellows was liquidated. After 157 years, the industry Robbins and Lawrence started was gone. What follows the death of a one-industry town is grimly predictable, and Springfield was not spared any of it. As recently as 1980, the machine tool industry had still employed about 3,000 people there. Within a generation, nearly all of those jobs were gone, and the identity went with them, because in Springfield you weren't just employed by the shops, you were from the shops, third and fourth generation. household income sank to $10,000 below the Vermont median. Roughly a third of residents came to rely on some form of public assistance. The empty plants turned out to be soaked in a century of industrial solvents, brownfields so contaminated the state spent millions just to make them safe to touch, and one local official called the J&L site the mother of all brownfields. The town's own development corporation bought the flagship plant of a global industry for less than the price of a house. Drugs moved into streets that had once jammed with 3 shifts of commuters. And the biggest new employer to arrive in the 2000s said everything about the change. It was a state prison. Then, in the summer of 2007, 5 years after the bankruptcy, Springfield made national news one more time, and you'd never guess how. 20th Century Fox held a contest among 14 American towns named Springfield, from Illinois to Massachusetts to Oregon, to host the world premiere of The Simpsons movie. Tiny Springfield, Vermont, the smallest town in the field, organized, campaigned, and won the online vote by 733 ballots over Springfield, Illinois. For one strange July night, searchlights swept a town whose actual claim to being famous, the claim written in steel and shipped to every factory on Earth, had been erased from public memory so completely that it took a cartoon to put Springfield's name in the papers. The crowd cheered on the same streets the war workers had walked. Almost nobody watching the movie knew. You'd think someone would have said something. Somebody did. Back in the 1960s, when a utility company proposed demolishing the old Robbins and Lawrence armory in Windsor, a Smithsonian curator named Edwin Battison, a Windsor native who had grown up in the shadow of the building, fought to save it, and in 1966 turned it into the American Precision Museum. The 4-story brick building that Lawrence raised beside Mill Brook in 1846 still stands, a National Historic Landmark, filled with the actual machines this story is made of: Howe's milling machines, Hartness's flat turret lathe, Fellows's gear shapers, Blanchard's stock copying lathe design, the tools that armed the Union, stunned the British Empire, and put the gears in the 20th century. One historian calls this corridor of the Connecticut River the Silicon Valley of its day, and standing on that shop floor, you can feel it. So the story ends where it started, at a brick armory on a small Vermont stream. In 1846, that building held the future of every factory on Earth. Today, it holds the evidence. The machines inside are silent now, but look closely at nearly anything made of metal in your life: the car, the plane, the machine that made your phone's machined parts. And somewhere in its ancestry is a gear or a thread or a bore that traces back to this valley. Richard Lawrence arrived in Windsor with nothing and taught the world to make identical things. A century and a half later, the world had learned the lesson so well it no longer needed the teacher. The empire fell. The idea it was built on never did. If Trade Archive is going to keep dragging stories like this out of the dark, we need one thing from you, and it's the subscribe button. The next video is on screen now. We'll see you there.